Hey, what's up, everyone? It's DeagleBeagle, and we're gonna go over the updated tier list. And even in making this video, it's not fully updated because I would say Iron Hands is barely top tier now. I mean, I was considering making it top tier before, like S tier, but there are just a lot of things about Iron Hands that seem to be weaknesses to me, but it is like probably the best jack of all trades Pokemon in the game. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you want a good fake outer, Iron Hands is outclassed by Rillaboom as far as a fake outer goes because it's slower. But that's just looking at it as a fake outer when you can't look at it as just a fake outer. But let's say you want to take some other aspects of it and say it's like top tier. It's really bulky. I mean, so is some of these other Pokemon like Cresselia, but Cresselia's not top tier. Why do I say it's not top tier? Well, Cresselia, it even showed in Worlds that Cresselia just isn't an offensive Pokemon. Like, it barely has any offense, especially if it doesn't super affect anything, and it's really just there for speed control and supporting the ally for the most part. So they can kind of use that against you to your advantage. For example, to beat Lunar Blessing, you could just focus on one Pokemon like Cresselia, knowing it probably can't protect, and Lunar Blessing heals 25 for each. So instead of spreading the damage around evenly, you could just focus up on one Pokemon to counter that, or taunt or whatever. So Cresselia, it also being weak to Crunch, Chien-Pao, or immune, or dark types being immune to a lot of its attacks unless it has Moonblast, it just makes it kind of like so reliant on the ally. And if the ally is a physical Pokemon like Iron Hands, it's just going to get intimidated. That's also why I had an issue with Iron Hands, is because Intimidate counters it too much, it feels like, where it's like it doesn't do enough after it's intimidated. Like, it doesn't get any one-shots anymore and does way less damage after one Intimidate. So what other reasons did I say Iron Hands may not be top tier? Really, that's mostly it. It's doesn't really have a niche. That's the bottom line. Is like, what niche does Iron Hands have? It doesn't really have a niche. It's just a bulky, good stuff's Pokemon that is also offensive. I suppose that's its niche, is that it has high bulk but also high offense, unless something comes in to counter that. So if they have no Intimidate, and well, it also depends on your Terra type. So let's say you're Terra Fire. That's probably the most ideal right now, because otherwise Chi-Yu plus Fluttermane could kill you or something like that. And if you use like Terra Water, yeah, that's better versus Urshifu and other Pokemon, and it's fine. But then you're weak to other Iron Hands, and you aren't resistant to what's super affecting you, like Fairy for the most part, and Ground. So Grass or Fire to me seem like a better Terra type for Iron Hands. And Iron Hands, it seems like it's just so weak to Intimidate, and there was a lot of Intimidate in Worlds. So you're seeing Iron Hands used a lot, but just because it's the number 2 Pokemon in usage doesn't mean it's number 2 in tier. I don't think it's number 2 in tier. I think it's more around maybe the 10th or so best Pokemon. It might actually be better than like Dragonite and stuff. Dragonite I might actually move down a tier. And since there's so much Iron Hands now, Goldango is seemingly worse, even though it just depends on how you use it. But Goldango's ability gives it a really useful niche. Iron Hands doesn't have really a good niche for its ability. It doesn't have any niche besides it just being bulky and offensive, and maybe its combination of stab moves with fake out. It's kind of an awkward Pokemon. Rillaboom having terrain, hitting really hard with Wood Hammer, having a faster fake out. I would probably prefer to use something like that. If I did use hands, I'd probably make it faster to hopefully outspeed other Iron Hands. But that's why I was mainly hesitant to put any of these Pokemon in top tier, is because they either didn't have a niche. Their niche was like outclassed by some other Pokemon in the S tier, or the Mons in the S tier just have a really good niche, like Frig walling priority moves and its ally, but you can still use priority moves with your ally, so it's not like psychic terrain. And then I don't know why Joe, I don't think this even has Indeedee in it. Does it? Some of these Pokemon in Joe UX9's tier list weren't even there. Like I didn't even see. Maybe Indeedee is in here. I swear Armor-Rouge is, but Indeedee I don't think was even here. But if it was here, I'd probably put in B tier. Okay, so let's just go through it one by one really quick. Rillaboom, good fake outer, strong grass move. It counters some Pokemon, even though we're not seeing a ton of Rillaboom usage anymore, probably because grass is weak to a lot of things and it might be forced to Terra. Like Tornadus is common, Chiu's common, Qianpow's common, Dragonite with Aerial Ace, Goldango can wall it unless you use knockoff. Well, even, I guess it could use Stomping Tantrum, so I guess it's not that bad versus Goldango. And Amoonguss walls it, but it's still probably barely top tier overall, even though I wouldn't personally probably use it. So yeah, I think it's about as good as Iron Hands overall. So that's why I was going to move Iron Hands up. And then Qianpao, its ability is really good sometimes. But even if it didn't have the ability, and let's just say it hit 30% harder or whatever. Actually, go to Bulbapedia. How much harder does Sword of Ruins boost? I think it makes it 0.75, right? So what's, yeah, 1 divided by 0.75 is, yeah, one third more. So 1/3 more damage for I believe it and its ally and the opponents if they're physical, except it doesn't apply that to itself. And same with Chiyu. So these Pokemon are great because even with that ability, they just have good stats and offense, and it really helps ally nab kills. Like if you have a Flutter Mane next to Chiyu, now all of a sudden you can pick up way more kills with Flutter Mane and get a lot more use out of it. Same with Qianpao with Urshifu or whatever. You can just pick up KOs you otherwise wouldn't. But even without that, it's a fast Pokemon with 2 pretty good stab moves. Like Crunch is better than Throat Chop because there's not a lot of sound moves. Dragonite, the reason why I made it top tier is because even though the way people use it doesn't seem to be top tier for the most part, because I don't think Dragonite typically should be leading. I think that's the biggest mistake people make with it, is they just lead Dragonite. No, you can, but usually I would think you should have it in back because Qian Pao and Dragonite are both weak to Fairy, and you need to try to whittle them down before you start trying to extreme speed. So feel like most people use it wrong, and some teams have done really well with Dragonite and won tournaments or almost won tournaments. So the main issue with Dragonite seems to be is that it's used wrong, but if it's used correctly, I think it's really good. And you would probably want to use multi-scale with it and use it in the back, but if you're almost always leading with it, then Inner Focus is probably the better ability. And Goldango, it isn't quite as good as it used to be because we're seeing a lot more Iron Hands now instead of Rillaboom. Probably because Rillaboom is weak to so many things, and it only has one stab move. So, and it doesn't have the bulk that Iron Hands has. However, it does put up more of a fight when intimidated by a Landorus. However, some people do use Arcanine H, even though I don't think that Pokemon's very high tier. It's like medium tier, upper medium tier. And then Flutter Mane is great. You have it's the most used Pokemon for a reason. It has really high speed and offense and great spread move, self-explanatory, immune to fake out. And we already went over Frigg. Amoonguss, if you're just trying to use it for spore spamming, it's not top tier, but I think it's top tier because you can use it for more than that. Like, you can Rage Powder with it, you can Pollen Puff the ally, and you kind of force them to bring the spore immunity, so you kind of shut down their options. And if you have it with the right ally, like, you know who their spore immunities are if it's open team sheets, and then you could just have the right ally with it. So whether that be Goldango, Iron Hands, whatever, you could just force them to play a certain way and use that against them. And if they don't play that way, then they might just get spore spammed. I prefer Terra Dark with Amoonguss. I believe that is the better Terra than Water overall because you don't want to get shut down by Taunt, and it's immune to Psychic, and it still has good typing to wall stuff with Dark overall. Like, even versus an Icicle Crash, it'll only take neutral instead of resist. The main thing is avoiding super effective attacks and taunt. So if you're not using Mental Herb, Terra Dark makes a lot of sense. It really depends on the team, though. Terra Water is technically a better defensive typing if you're not worried about a psychic move or getting taunted. And Landorus is, to me, probably the second best Pokemon in the game because it's the best Intimidator overall. It really shuts down Iron Hands, and that is used second most in Worlds, and even outside of Worlds, it's one of the most common Pokemon. Like Tornadus, Flutter Mane, Urshifu, Iron Hands are used. Probably the top 4 Mons. And then Landorus is just really good for pivoting with U-turn, Intimidate, Stomping Tantrum. You can outspeed Pokemon like even Flutter Mane or Qian Pao with it too, and even one-shot a Flutter Mane with Terra Flying Blast, or have coverage versus a Pokemon like Rillaboom. And Rillaboom also being immune to Spore makes it good, and its terrain sometimes change terrain or boost up it and its allies' grass attacks, even though it could boost the opponents. And then Ape is here and Mouse Hole. They should be right next to each other because Mouse Ape is always a decent combo. And then Glamora is really good if they don't have a poison type like a Moongus. If they do, they could get away with like ignoring it sometimes, but it's kind of hard to ignore it because it could do a lot. Like, it can Mortal Spin, or it could just super affect them with Sludge Bomb or Power Gem. So it kind of puts them in a huge pickle if they don't have a poison type. They might like attack it though with a physical attack, and then just send in like a steel type and a flying type in back, or kind of knock out one thing, like knock out its ally, and then try to take it out later. So the poison isn't as much of an issue. And then I'll just go over S and A tiers. All the rest, I don't think they're that consistent, and they could be good on some teams, but overall, I would not recommend them, because I already tested them out, like Gyarados and stuff, and it's just, it doesn't do enough. So I went over that. Hatterene. A lot of these Pokemon are like only good for the most part in hard Trick Room, like Hatterene, Glastier, well, I shouldn't say hard Trick Room, like you could use semi Trick Room, but what I mean is like they kind of rely on Trick Room to be good. Torkoal is kind of like that of a Pokemon, except you can use it outside of Trick Room too, with like Lilligant or H, or even without Lilligant. You could use it just to boost up photosynthesis, even though that could boost up the opponent. So you're not necessarily getting an advantage. But also the sun weakening water moves like Urshifu makes it potentially pretty good. And then, what's the next one? Grimmsnarl. Since Urshifu, both forms are pretty common, I'm just not going to make it top tier. Also, since Fluttermane is so common and Goldango is somewhat common. But regardless, there's ways to mitigate that. Like I use Gastrodon with Grimmsnarl, and I use like a Terra Fairy Gastrodon, so that even if they use Single Strike, I can still wall that. And I use Tinkaton also to wall Wicked Blow. But then Gastrodon walls the Surging Strike, so they can't just like crit through your screens. They would have to get a lucky crit with some other move. So that's why Grimmsnarl, it's sort of like the hard Trick Room Pokemon. Like by themselves they're not top tier, but with the right team they could be, in a sense, for that team. But just slapping it on a team, no, it's not quite top tier. And then that's the same Gastrodon as before, just a different form, or whatever you call it, sprite. East versus West. And then Heatran, that Pokemon is not quite top tier because it has a lot of weaknesses, so you're kind of forced to tear with it a lot. That's why I normally would recommend leading with Pokemon that don't have a lot of weaknesses, like probably not leading with Heatran, even though you can versus some teams. But generally you want to keep it in back, and when they have a Pokemon that, two Pokemon that you wall pretty well, like Fluttermane and something, you could switch it in, or even if you just wall one of them, you could kind of predict the Dazzling Gleam or Moonblast, switch it in, and hope that their ally doesn't target that slot. And later, if you have to bust a Terra, it might be worth it, but to just lead with it after Terra first turn is probably not the best use for it. Tatsugiri, Dondozo, that's still a good combo because Dondozo is resistant to Surging Strikes, so it doesn't do a ton of damage, and you can even use it on a team where you use Sunny Day and also lower the power of Surging Strikes. And when you protect, it only takes the Urshifu's attack and not their allies, even though it would do more than the leftovers, so you probably wouldn't want to protect unless you're like stalling out Trick Room or Tailwind or whatever. And then Ursaluna is good, but you kind of need Trick Room with it. And Pelipper is good with like Basculegion or on a screens team, just for helping to reduce damage in general from fire attacks and having wide guard, or if you want to use Tailwind maybe. But I use it for Surf with Gastrodon, and it boosts up the Gastrodon's offense, but then you can also just Surf when you otherwise wouldn't want to because it would hurt your ally, and Surf is just a really good move, spread move, and yeah, it hits both opponents and it doesn't miss like Hydro Pump. I would not recommend usually using Pelipper outside of using it with Surf just because of accuracy issues. And then Talonflame is like Tornadus except more accurate, but it doesn't have a good spread move. But it is faster, so you don't have to worry about getting taunted, even though you can just use a Mental Herb or Terra Dark Tornadus and Terra Dark if you have to, or you could just use a max speed Tornadus and hope that you win the speed tie if they're faster. Like, chances are they're not even using max speed anyways, so you could probably just do that. But it's nice to use a max HP Tornadus if you can get away with it, because you usually don't need the speed that much. You have the Tailwind for that, and you're just naturally faster than like Rillaboom and other Pokemon. And then went over Glacier. Mousehold's good with like Goldango or Ape or whatever. Volcarona, you're probably going to be most surprised of why I have that in A tier. It's because it has good resist and good offense too. With Quiver Dance, it's good for setting up. Like, you could set up versus a lot of teams, even versus Urshifu, Fluttermane, Iron Hands, Amoonguss. A lot of Pokemon you could set up versus even like Landorus, unless it's wanting to commit to a Terra Flying Blast. You can kind of even use it versus Tornadus, especially if you outspeed it with the Quiver Dance, or they don't Bleak Wind Storm the turn before you get Quiver Dance up or the speed advantage up. It just has great offense because Heat Wave just hits a lot, as you can tell, like Amoonguss, or even if it just takes neutral like Frigg or Fluttermane, it's going to do a lot and outspeed it, get the special defense boost. And if you use it with an Intimidator like Landorus, then it helps it on the physical side too, especially if you also have a Fake Outer. Like, you have like Volcarona, Landorus, Iron Hands. I might make a team like that. I was just even using it with Tauros and it was doing really well, like a Tauros Blaze form. So I know it's a good Pokemon. And this guy was setting up on me, and like and then when I used it, this guy used Surging Strikes on me, and I used Terra Grass, and with Flame Body, it has a super high chance to burn it with the 3 hits. So they get burned almost every time, and it's just really good. And you're immune to Spore, and then you boost up the Giga Drain so that you can like kill stuff like Urshifu, like Bulky Waters, and it's really nice. Except some Pokemon wallet like fire types like Heatran and stuff, but you can use your ally for that. Can't do everything. And then Urshifu, both forms are supposed to be in here, are A tier. They might be S tier, but I'm hesitant, especially to put Rapid Strike in S tier, because even though it has an amazing ability and crit moves, it just, everyone's trying to counter it, and Water offensively isn't nearly as good as it used to be at the start of the format. And then Dark is good, but you have to rely on Sucker Punch instead of Aqua Jet for priority, and there's a decent amount of Pokemon that wall Dark just even without having a Terra, like Iron Hands, or they have like Terra Fairy or whatever. So both Urshifu's aren't amazing, but the ability is amazing. So if you can somehow use that to pin a Pokemon like we saw in Worlds, then that's really good. And yeah, naturally set up Pokemon like Frigg might get pressured by that, so you might have to use it in back or whatever. And then Basculegion, that guy with Scarf adaptability, I never really thought about that. I was always thinking to use it with Swift Swim, because otherwise it's too slow. But if you use it with Scarf, adaptability also boosts up the Ghost moves. Don't forget that. So Last Respects is naturally like I think it's 33% more, like a third more powerful. What's 2 divided by 1.5? Yeah, it's a third. Just like it's the same as 1 divided by 0.75. Yeah, exactly the same. So adaptability makes it do double damage instead of the 50% extra from stab. So it's basically like a slightly more powerful than Life Orb, except I believe you probably should use Jolly if you're using Scarf, because Basculegion is rather slow. So that is one downside of it, but you don't take Life Orb recoil. But the main pro of it is that you don't have to use Pelipper and use this inconsistent Pokemon with Hydro Pump. I would personally only use it with Surf. That's just me. So if you can use this without Pelipper, you have more offensive and defensive variety, and it's not as predictable. Like they're gonna know you have to bring Pelipper in a lot of times, but if you don't have to do that, then that's good, and that's why I think we saw a guy in Worlds on stream use it with Scarf adaptability, and it was really good, and he ended up winning the set. So yeah, that's good. And I mean, some Pokemon you would think would be A tier, like Tinglu, but and maybe it is, but I don't personally think so, because it does have a really good ability, but I don't know. It's just there's a lot of new Pokemon that counter it, like Rillaboom, and it just doesn't have amazing offense. You have to kind of rely a lot on Ruination, because Stomping Tantrum or Earthquake won't necessarily do that much, or Throat Chop or whatever. But it is still potentially really good on some teams like Patrick Donegan's team with the Blizzard team. So yeah, I think that's mostly it. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next one.